wrongfully undermining her capacity as a knower. So in other words, it is when a person A, because of the prejudices or the bias he or she has, because of the society we lived in and we are immersed in, that person doesn't give credibility to another person B in a context where that person B, that is the speaker, is has some knowledge about it and has some insights about that field, but that person doesn't trust what he's saying. So what I think is that not listening to patients, well, like in the psychiatry field, is so many times a case of epistemic injustice, because doctors or physicians are not taking service users as interlocutors. They are denying them the capacity as knowers they have because of the illness they have. They don't trust what they have to say. They don't believe that what they have to say is important or has some reliability to the psychiatric diagnosis or even to their own treatment. So to understand better how this happened in psychiatry, how like this patient doctor relationship ends up in epistemic injustice, let's start saying what like types of epistemic injustice there are. So Freaker talks about two types of epistemic injustice. She talks about testimonial or hermeneutical epistemic injustice. The former affects individuals and groups in their capacity of knowers in their everyday lives, and the latter is more related to a structural form of injustice. So testimonial injustice is, how I said, when someone, because of the prejudices or the misconception he has, he doesn't give credibility to that person, to another person, because he believes that person is not trustworthy or is not reliable. But that is not because he knows for sure that person is not reliable, or he has some background about that person to say that what he or she is saying is not important or is not valuable. Is because the prejudices and bias they have that make her or him think that person is not trustworthy or reliable. Then on the other hand, we have hermeneutical injustice that in words of Freaker occurs at a prior stage when a gap in the collective interpretative resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. To put that example that Freaker uses in her book, we have sexual harassment. Not so many years ago, many 20 or 30 years ago, a woman can like be victim of what we now call sexual harassment, but she was not aware of what was happening to her. She doesn't even have the words. She didn't have words to express what she was feeling, and that made her think she was the only one, and that was something that happened to her and not to everybody. So this kind of epistemic injustice happens when the society has some structural power that put us in a position where we cannot express how we are feeling, because those expressions are not in the world that has been made for us. So since Freaker's book, other authors have developed other conceptions about epistemic injustice, and there are some that I want to talk about that are very related to the psychiatrist-patient relationship and the epistemic injustice that happens in this relationship. So first we have Anke Buter. She talks about preemptive epistemic injustice, and that is when the patients or their carers are not given the opportunity to talk about their illness, about their experience, about what they are feeling is important about their condition. They are not listened to. They are not even given the opportunity to talk about what they have to say, because they are not considered interlocutors. They are considered lay people or patients, and they don't have any authority, or they are not experts, so they don't have anything to say about it. Then we have from Catala, Faucher, and Perel, the testimonial smothering, and that is, quote, when a potential speaker knows, often for a prior personal experience, that their testimony is unlikely to receive an appropriate level of credibility or uptake because of their interlocutor's bias, and hence refrains from engaging accordingly. So this case of epistemic injustice shows us that epistemic injustice is not something that happens one time. It's not a one-time scenario. It's something that is recurrent, that it happens a lot of the times to different people or to the same person in different situations. So if I am victim of epistemic injustice today, it is possible that I'm going to be victim of epistemic injustice again later, or that I'm going to be victim of testimonial smothering, because if I know that even if I am given the opportunity to talk, that I'm not going to be trusted and that I'm not going to be believed, what to bother? Why will I choose to talk if I'm not going to be believed, if no one is going to take me seriously? These two cases could be the door to what I like to call self-epistemic injustice, and is when a person considers her or himself not capable of knowledge. So what I think is that after a person has been victim of epistemic injustice in a reiterative amount of cases, and this happens a lot of times in many particular situations that are alike. For example, if I go to the psychiatrist and I told him about what I am feeling and what I think it's very important for my treatment and for the diagnosis, but I don't feel like the doctor take me into account or doesn't think I am an interlocutor, then I start doubting about myself. I start questioning, maybe I am the problem, maybe what I am saying is not reliable, is not important. Maybe it's true that I don't have any knowledge. There's another case of epistemic injustice, but this is different from the three that I already mentioned, because this one is an hermeneutical case, a hermeneutical injustice case, and it's called cognitive injustice. And in the words of Legault, Bourdain, and Perret, it happens when the collective cognitive resources, the concepts, methods, tools, etc., that contribute to cognitive performance and development of a society do not provide resources to a given cognitive profile. So, for example, if I have ADHD, it is very possible that my head works in a different way that is not entitled to gain knowledge in the same way as what we call neurotypical person does. So if a person with ADHD tries to gain knowledge from the concepts and the tools that already exist, it's very possible that he's not going to be very successful at it, because he has different forms of understanding the world and not given that opportunity to people as a case of epistemic injustice. Finally, we have McKinnon, that she has another form of like talking about epistemic injustice, and she says that this happens when an audience, due to an identity prejudice, doesn't properly regard the speaker as a knower. That is, the audience doesn't regard the speaker as a source of knowledge. So in this case, a person may be given the opportunity to talk, maybe can be invited somewhere to talk, but since the beginning, that person is not going to be taken into account. Anything she or he says is not going to be considered as valuable. He's only there to meet a quote. There's an example that happens with the advocate groups, and they sometimes invite people with, let's take the case of autism. They invite autistic people or people with autism to talk about what they need and what they should advocate for, and they listen to them, or they pretend to listen to them. But then when they are going to do the advocacy, they do nothing about what the service user had to say, because they were not taken into account. They were just there because it was nice to have them there. So there are some questions that arise from this different types of epistemic injustice in the psychiatric area, and is in the hands of the doctor to stop these cases of epistemic injustice, or who are responsible for them, and which is the best way to face these cases. Is there something that we as researchers can do to change these patterns? And finally, are there other cases of epistemic injustice that arise from the patient-doctor relationship, or like these are the ones that have been studied in recent years, but could there be more? Are there more forms in which patients are affected by epistemic injustice in the psychiatry area? So another thing that I have found during the time I've been researching epistemic injustice in psychiatry is that in many cases it's very difficult to determine when the reason for not listening is in fact epistemic injustice, or maybe something else. There are many different reasons for which the doctor, the physician, is not listening to the patient. So, for example, we have the case when the person is deluded. So what he or she's saying cannot be taken into account. He or she could be saying something valuable or something important, but if the doctor knows that she is in not the right state of mind, he cannot trust what she's saying because she's out of herself, to put it in some words. There's another case, and is when the clinician he has enough criteria to believe that that person has reasons to lie. So if the doctor knows that a person is intended to lie, even if that person is telling the truth, this is not epistemic injustice, because the doctor has prior information that made him believe he or she's lying. So how can we determine when it's epistemic injustice and when it's not? How can we get better at sorting out the difference between cases of epistemic injustice and cases when the reason for not listening is different. There's another case that I want to talk about of not epistemic injustice, and as the practical constraint. Usually the doctors, at least in the UK, doesn't have a lot of time to listen to patients. They will have, say, 20 minutes to listen to what a patient has to say. So it's going to be very difficult to talk about everything and to listen to everything, because the doctor needs to have enough information to do his job during that small time. So what for a doctor is just another case in the 10 or 11 cases he's going to see that day, for the patient is their unique moment with the doctor. So is there something to be done about the system to make it more friendly to the service users or patients? Because maybe if the approach to psychiatry and to mental health were different and there were not so many constraints, there could be a better relationship between patients and doctors, and maybe there could be a real relationship that, of course, in 20 minutes is not very easily to happen because you don't have time to bond. And could a change in how the system works will benefit the patients, and will this mean like less cases of epistemic injustice? Because even if there are many cases in which they are not listening, not because it is epistemic injustice, but there are cases where it is epistemic injustice. So in the end, I have found out as well that if it is indeed a case of epistemic injustice, there are other factors that arise. And is that person victim of epistemic injustice just because he or she is a patient or service user, or is there another reason? An example, women with autism are many times misdiagnosed because their symptoms are not very common or are not the stereotypical symptoms that men with autism show. So doctors don't pay attention to those other symptoms because they are looking for the characteristical symptoms. So for that reason, ASD has been like in a recent review, it said that like the male-female ratio is to 3 to 1, but it doesn't mean that it's like a man disease. It's just that like there may be bias, like gender bias and gender perceptions that make it very difficult to diagnose women with autism. There's another example, and it is borderline personality disorder. So it is predominantly diagnosed to women, and here the ratio is 3 to 1, male to female. And we could think, oh yes, it's because borderline is a women disease, but a Henry and Cohen study had concluded that certain behaviors are only considered as pathological when they occur in women and not in men, and that could be one of the reasons that make borderline a female disease. So this is a case of gender bias, and it is also important when we are talking about epistemic injustice. So I believe it's very important that we use intersectionality when we are talking about this, because this is the only way we are going to completely understand epistemic injustice, because we need to take into account other factors as class, gender, race, even migrant status. So to conclude, I wanted to ask you, do you have any idea? So what is the best way of approaching cases of epistemic injustice in psychiatry?